Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first address from the Christians for an Ethical Society. My name is Stephen Pickard. I'm the Executive Director here and also co-chair with Clive Roger of the committee. But as we begin, first of all, we acknowledge the traditional owners of this custodians of this land upon which we meet, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We really are delighted that you're here for this first occasion. So many things have happened in the last month where people have come together for the first time in 12 months. So this is really quite a joyful occasion for us too. And to begin to say a word of welcome, I'd like to welcome the President of Christians for an Ethical Society, Emeritus Professor John Warhurst from the Australian National University. John, please.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And perhaps the first thing I could do, in addition to welcoming you all here this evening, and of course welcoming Professor Shanice Miller and Tony Hassan, is to thank Stephen Pickard of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, who are great partners with Christians for an Ethical Society and have been for some time. In the society today, I think groups such as Christians for an Ethical Society are extremely necessary to the good health of our democracy. We need strong non-government organisations to be discussing the issues of the day in a way which is analytical and critical and forceful, passionate where necessary, and loud where necessary too. Christians for an Ethical Society is proud to be able to maintain its tradition of doing so with a new series of talks for 2021. And as Stephen Pickard mentioned, it's really a new era for us with both face-to-face here in the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and broadcasting widely through Zoom. And I think that's a sign of the times as well. It enables us not only to experience the fellowship of being able to join together here in Canberra at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, but to make our talks and our voice available to a much wider range of people. And I know I have a friend in Melbourne who will be linking in this evening, and I'm sure there'll be many more. So we're really speaking to two audiences, and perhaps both audiences could recognise that fact. Someone said to me just a minute ago, isn't it a shame that we couldn't be living in two worlds and that we could be sitting here but also having the Zoom experience, and people on the Zoom could be flashing in for a bit of the face-to-face experience. But both are an important part of the package, and I will echo Stephen Pickard in welcoming you here this evening on behalf of Christians for an Ethical Society, and looking forward very much to this evening's event. Thanks again. Thank you, Stephen.
So now, down to business. The theme for this year is values and voices in the public sphere. It was also the theme for 2020, but there's a reason why we've continued that theme for this year. And to begin this year's series, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Shanice Miller, whose topic is political propaganda, freedom of communication, and truth on social media. Professor Miller currently holds research appointments in philosophy at Charles Sturt University, at Delft University of Technology in The Hague, and the University of Oxford. He is the principal investigator on a European Research Council advanced grant on counter-terrorism ethics. He has co-authored or authored over 200 academic articles and 22 books, including Moral Foundations of Social Institutions and Institutional Corruption. And a personal note, I've known Shanice for over 20 years. He was the inaugural director of the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University, and their first site was just up the hill over there in a little house that we organised. Somewhat unusual circumstances about 20 years ago, and a friend as well as a colleague. So Shanice, welcome to this first address for Professor Miller.
Well, thanks very much, John, and thanks very much, Stephen, and for giving me this opportunity. Belatedly, thanks, Stephen, for the house 20 years ago up on the hill. I hadn't realised that. Thank you for that. And thanks especially to you people for coming. So there's my topic. So let me get to it. Some examples of disinformation, misinformation. I won't go into the various distinctions, but I hope these are pretty much familiar to you. It's working. That's a triumph in itself. Okay. So some examples of disinformation, and disinformation, of course, is intimately connected with propaganda, though there are some important differences and distinctions. But typically, disinformation is a critical part of propaganda. So, President Trump, former President Trump, claiming that the recent election was a fraud in the context of that having been disproved in multiple court cases, a good example, I think, of disinformation. Human-induced climate change is a hoax. Is that being contrary to most overwhelming percentage of climate scientists and relevant scientific bodies, presumably another example of disinformation. COVID-19 is a hoax. Presumably the 500,000 approximately dead people in the US is sufficient evidence that claim is false. And another example in this context might be Cardinal George Pell, his process to the High Court, where he was demonstrably shown to be innocent, not simply not guilty but innocent, since it turned out that he couldn't possibly, unless he could be in two places at once, have committed the offence he was accused of. But that whole process, I think, was a manifestation in part of the power of social media and of the media, in that instance, interfering, I think, in the process, in the justice process, if not downright perverting it, at least in the earlier decisions. Okay, so an important distinction in this area is between disinformation, which is actually unlawful and should be unlawful. And we think of examples here like inciting violence, say terrorist propaganda, perhaps in the recent riots, demonstrations in the US, arguably Trump incited violence, perverting the course of justice, trial by social media, defamation, civil offence rather than a criminal one, but nevertheless one that you can seek remedy for, or directly causing serious harm. And the famous John Stuart Mill example of screaming, shouting fire in a crowded theatre, but presumably advocating disinfectant for COVID would come into that category as well. So disinformation, which is and or ought to be unlawful, is one kind of disinformation. But other sorts of disinformation are not unlawful and ought not to be unlawful, even though they're falsehoods and they may have a malevolent intent. And the reason for this, particularly when it comes to political communication, is that we value freedom of speech, and in valuing freedom of speech, we necessarily will need to live with falsehoods, including falsehoods that are motivated by malice and so on. Okay, so propaganda and so on that is unlawful, ought to be unlawful, we can we can proceed, even if with some difficulty in the case of social media, we can proceed to try to get rid of it, to enforce laws against it and so on. But the problem is, now what do we do about disinformation propaganda, which is lawful, and we want it to be lawful because it's an expression of a very important right in liberal democracies, namely the right to freedom of speech. So if someone wants to say climate change is a hoax, then it looks like we're going to have to say, well, okay, they can say that, even if it's not true. If someone perhaps less plausibly wants to say and even gets elected to high office, saying 9/11 is a hoax, we're probably going to have to live with that too. Okay, so much is something we've been doing for a very long time. So what's the problem? Well, the problem now is in relation to the disinformation that we have to live with because it's an expression of freedom of speech. It's been turbocharged, if you like, by social media platforms and some of the effects that that's had, or the enablement that that's given certain groups. So we've now got billions of communicators worldwide. We've got, as people have detailed in all over the place in this country and other places, we've got the effects of echo chambers and the like that exponentially increase the disinformation and political propaganda that relative to what was before social media, and of course has also empowered a whole range of political groups, empowered conspiracy theorists, and so on, and been an important causal contributor to things like the attack on the US Congress, which is clearly something that has undermined to some extent, and if it were to continue in the US and elsewhere, would certainly have a deleterious effect on democracy. So it's a problem. From the point of view of this group, but the secular society more generally, we need, as a society, whether it's a Christian society or a functioning secular society, we need epistemic and moral norms, which is to say we need various principles, such as principles of commitment to truth, principles of evidence, commitments to truth, commitments to finding evidence to support the claims we make, and so on pain of undermining public discourse, undermining fundamental institutions, and ultimately undermining the capacity of the citizenry to function as responsible citizens in a democratic polity. And so, from that perspective, the ongoing effect of all this is to undermine these epistemic and moral norms and ultimately corrode the society and its institutions. Okay, now when it comes to going back to the phenomenon that I mentioned that are unlawful and ought to be unlawful political violence, incitement to violence, perversion of the course of justice and so on, those norms rely heavily, of course, on enforcement by the relevant by the criminal justice system. But they also rely on social disapproval. When it comes to compliance with these epistemic and social norms, which is such that we want to allow non-compliance because we're committed to a strong principle of freedom of speech. We can't have recourse to the laws and the enforcement of the laws. And so, in this context of turbocharged disinformation, propaganda and so on, we have a problem, a bigger problem than we had before. Of course, we've also got huge benefits. We have some of the benefits, it's not quite the same thing, but we have some of the benefits that direct democracies had, insofar as individual citizens can now directly via social media communicate with very large numbers of other citizens. The citizenry doesn't have to wholly rely on intermediary institutions such as radio, TV and those organisations that we've been relying on prior to social media. But the downside, as I've said, is this exponential increase in disinformation, propaganda and related phenomena. One of the principal properties of social media as it currently exists, which is contributing to the problem, is anonymity. That is, you've got people who are saying things all over the place, vilifying people, sending out untruths, etc., and they're not accountable because they're anonymous. Another problem is that we have the rise of demagogues in this context, which is similar to, but somewhat different from the demagoguery of old, of Athens and so on, where you've got a political leader who can directly communicate with a very large number of members of the population and manipulate it in various ways that wouldn't have been able to the same extent in the pre-social media days. Okay, so in terms of moving forward, I think we need to get a couple of distinctions on the table. First of all, when people talk about freedom of speech, they often oscillate between freedom of speech for ordinary human beings and freedom of speech for organisations, such as corporations in terms of their advertising, or news media organisations. But I think it's very important to get clear that the fundamental right to freedom of speech, the basic right to freedom of speech, is a right of individual human beings and is very closely related to the right of freedom of thought. Institutional rights, by contrast, are not as fundamental. They're derived typically in indirect ways, including freedom of the press, although obviously the freedom of the press is rather more important than the right to commercial speech of corporations and other private sector actors. And one thinks here of the appropriateness of restricting, say, advertising. However, the point I want to stress here is that these institutions, unlike the basic human right of freedom of speech, these various institutional rights, the rights of organisations, ought only to exist insofar as they contribute to a larger social purpose, some kind of common good. The freedom of the press is not just a sort of basic right of journalists, full stop. It's a right of journalists, editors and so on, and the organisations that they work for, insofar as they exercise that right for the common good. And insofar as they diverge from that, then that right is one that may need to be taken away. But that is not the case for this more fundamental human right of individual human beings, the right of free speech. That point, I think, is important when it comes to social media companies, because they're no different from any other human organisation or institution. The rights that are allocated to those organisations and the duties that are allocated to those organisations for their members are derived from the larger common good, whatever it is that those institutions exist to provide. So there is no basic right, full stop, per se, of a social media company any more than there's one of an ordinary corporation. It all depends on the good that that corporation, no doubt in conjunction with other corporations in a given market, delivers, whether or not it's an adequate supply of housing in the case of the housing market, whether or not it's an adequate supply of food in the case of the agricultural sector and so on. If the institutions aren't delivering on the good which justifies their existence, then we need to think very carefully as to whether or not they need to be radically redesigned or renovated. So radical proposals in relation to social media are entirely justified if the social media is not delivering the good, the public good that we want it to deliver. One of the things that has now happened then, if we reflect for a moment on the rise of social media, is that in terms of the role of public communication mediated by media organisations, news media and so on, the way that was handled, that is, and when I say the way it was handled, I mean the problem of disinformation, propaganda, low-level content floating around, the way that was handled was to insist that the press be independent of government, but also that the press have a degree of independence even of its own owners, so you had editorial independence. Professionalisation of journalists so that they were people who were committed to distinctions between news and comment, who had internalised epistemic virtues such as looking for the evidence and so on and so forth. Now all that whole institutional arrangement still exists, and it was always imperfect, but now we've got a whole new ball game insofar as we've got social media and the possibility, as I mentioned before, of powerful actors including politicians but also others, to directly communicate and bypass those mediating epistemic organisations. Of course, this is a great opportunity for, as I said, the citizens to communicate directly to large numbers of people. But it's also, as it turns out, a serious problem because certainly in the current state of play, this public communication is largely unregulated, and hence the vast amount of, unlawful in some cases, but certainly the vast amount of disinformation, propaganda and so on, which is problematic for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what's to be done? Well, what's to be done is a very complex story, and I'm not going to give you all the answers. I'm going to give you some suggestions which may be useful in terms of discussion. But there's a couple of things I just want to stress here, and that is that in the current arrangements, the social media giants tend to want to say, well, we're platforms, therefore we're not publishers, so we're not liable for a whole lot of this content. But at the same time, they get involved in the business of removing content, of talking about a community that has certain values and so on and so forth. Now, the first obvious point is you can't have it both ways. Either you're simply a platform, you're not regulating any of the content, we need an external regulator, or you are a publisher and you need to be held liable for all this disinformation, propaganda and stuff that's being peddled on your platform. You can't have it both ways. In the end, I think that you're going to need some kind of independent institution, and the idea that these social media companies can actually regulate content in accordance with the appropriate values and so on is really something of a pipe dream. It's not going to happen for a whole lot of reasons we can talk about. But in the redesign process, I think we want to sort of keep in mind what we want out of this, at least some of the things we want out of it. One is that citizens have certain rights in relation to functions that social media now carries out, and which are essentially functions that are a consequence of new technology. They're not, as it were, definitive of current institutional arrangements. We can have other arrangements in which, for example, people get access to high-quality search engines. We can have other arrangements in which people get access that ordinary citizens can communicate with vast numbers of other citizens, as they can currently do with Twitter and so on. We don't actually have to have the current set of institutional arrangements. Whether we ought to have the current arrangements, but with some more regulations. One option. Another option would be to go with another arrangement, just have public utilities and so on. There's various options. The other point I would make is that in all this mess, we do need, as a liberal democracy, we do need something like the old free press. We do need independent channels of public communication. We do need investigative journalism. We do need experts and analytical people in the channels of public communication, which is to say those channels which reach most people on most of the important issues and most of the key actors are communicating. Okay, so I've got a particular set of suggestions now which won't take me more than a few minutes. I can see Stephen is getting a little nervous. And let me just say a few things about anonymity, because I think anonymity is one of the main problems in this area, because people can anonymously send messages to vast numbers of people. They can vilify people, they can say falsehoods, they can bully people, they can do many problematic things, they can pervert the course of justice, etc., etc. And they can certainly spread a lot of disinformation, and they can do so more or less with impunity, partly because we don't know who they are. So I want to make a couple of points about this before I make a couple of very specific suggestions in the last slide, which is the one following this one. Privacy is not the same thing as anonymity. Privacy is not the same thing as anonymity. An anonymous communicator is not exercising his or her right to privacy. He's just hiding who he is, or she is, or it is if it's an organisation, or it if it's a bot net. The next point you might find less conducive. I think we all have to agree that privacy is not anonymity. The next point I would make is that public communicators, that is, people who are communicating not to just a few people, not having a few tweets or just listening or reading tweets, but people who have the capacity and are currently enjoying the ability to communicate frequently and to very, very large numbers of people, are public communicators. And I want to suggest to you that if you're a public communicator, you have an enormous amount of power, and you have no right to anonymity. In fact, we've got a right to know who you are. So if you accept that, I'm now going to make a set of suggestions to deal with this problem or at least to try to deal with this problem, to reduce anonymity and therefore, to that extent, hopefully reduce disinformation and so on. And the idea here is simply to bring people, as it were, into the light in a manner that will curb their behaviour. Okay, so social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., account holders, including groups and organisations as well as individuals, I'm suggesting should have to register with an independent statutory authority. Now in Australia at the moment we do have the Office of E-Safety Commissioner, but it doesn't have the following powers, it has other powers. And I'm suggesting that in liberal democracies, anyone who has an account with Twitter or Facebook ought to have that account registered with an independent statutory authority, and before they can have an account, their identity has to be made known to that statutory authority via things like driver's license, passports, etc. In the same way that your identity would be verified if you want health insurance, or if you want to drive a car, or if you want to do a whole lot of other things. Secondly, the US, since a lot of the big service providers, the social media providers are there, but the US and any other liberal democracy which is hosting a social media provider are required by law only to provide the accounts to those who have registered with some statutory authority. So you don't act, even if you're in Kazakhstan, if you want to communicate on Facebook, you've got to be registered with the relevant statutory authority. And if Kazakhstan doesn't have a statutory authority, you'll have to find another one. This arrangement in place, most people, most of the time, will simply communicate anonymously unless they choose otherwise. So it's not going to make any difference to people who A, obeying the law, or B, aren't, as it were, big-time public communicators. You'll still be anonymous, unless you choose otherwise. However, if you breach the law, if your tweets or whatever, law enforcement will have the right of access to the statutory authority and under warrant and with reasonable suspicion and all the usual array of conditions, so that you can be prosecuted, you can lose your account and so on. So there won't be any anonymity under this arrangement for lawbreakers. Secondly, though, coming back to the big-time public communicators, the people who can actually do quite a lot of damage because they've got very large audiences. There'll be no right under this arrangement, I'm suggesting, no right for public communicators. If you're communicating with very large numbers of people, frequently we need to know who you are, because the power that you have is such that we can't continue to allow you to have anonymity. The final point is that, of course, one of the ways in which disinformation propaganda is driven and is a tsunami, as it were, is by way of these botnets, these automatic, these autonomous robots that, to a considerable extent, at any rate, rely on fake accounts. But on this arrangement, there won't be any fake accounts, because anyone who's got an account will have to have been identified and so on. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanice. Kickstarting our conversation tonight. I'd now like to welcome Tony Hassan, who's an adjunct research fellow at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, and also a fellow of the Australian Institute's Youth Centre for Responsible Technology, and certainly a friend and supporter of this place. So, Tony, I invite you to raise some questions and kickstart a conversation amongst all of us with Shanice and each other. Thank you, Tony.
G'day. Thank you. It's an honour to be here, and I'm people. I want to thank Professor Miller for articulating, I think, the tensions between freedom of speech and what we're really aiming for here, which is social cohesion, I believe. The norm, which he pointed to, the norms which are under a great deal of pressure because of the digital age, the norm of telling the truth, the norm of defaming people, the norm we don't defame people, that is, and the norm that we don't incite violence. These are clearly under a lot of pressure when you have a president saying, it didn't rain at my inauguration. No, it didn't. It really didn't. And the coronavirus, as you said, is totally under control. The election was a total fraud, and we saw the real-world implications of the kinds of disruptive behaviour, the breaking of epistemic. Is it epistemic? Yeah, epistemic norms. I've long been interested in social media from the perspective of a parent, an educator. It's not just the sort of short-term dopamine hits and the feedback loops that create real, I guess, fracturing in the community. It's the impact on our children's mental health, on our mental health, and also, of course, the impact on social discourse. It's not an American problem with the outgoing US president, it's a global problem. And I want to highlight that, I think it's very real to us with the role of the Murdoch press. I can't not bring that up because, he uses, or his machinery continues to use both traditional and new media to tell us fibs. In the wake of the Black Summer fires, there was a whole lot of stories about arson being the real reason for the tragedy of last January. Again, highlighting that finding clarity on important planet-threatening issues is becoming harder in a noisy, competitive marketplace that is social media, which is far from neutral. And as alluded to, he would rather robots or fake accounts continue to generate stories about that fabrication. So it points to an inability to get to the heart of things, to the truth of things. And these platforms, they really do have enormous market power. The platforms can use that market power to oppose who may hurt them. They're not interested in dialogue and peace, social cohesion. They're interested in conspiracies because it attracts eyeballs. They're merchants of our attention. Professor Miller made an important distinction, I think, between privately held rights of individuals, that is, our individual rights to access information, to communicate online with our friends and others, versus the right to institutional communication or public communication that's visible, knowledge that contributes to building our shared lives together. And as he said, the rights involve seeking the truth, thinking freely, and being able to discuss in a deliberative way the common good. These are rights not held by you and me, but held collectively. And of course, on our minds is Myanmar in the last few weeks. The rise of social media in the hands of the military or extreme groups can inflame hate. And the UN, I noted in an article I wrote some time ago, found that the military in Myanmar used social media to incite violence against the Rohingya. And of course, the coup since, I'm told, was inspired, people closer to it say, was inspired by the US president's or ex-US president's propaganda. The election in Burma was stolen. It's worth saying too that Facebook, which I'm not a user, has 2 billion users. That's a quarter of the world's population. So we're talking about staggering numbers of people where with extreme groups the access is enormous and their tribalism can be exploited and they can be ready to help others kill others because of their biases, hence the Christchurch massacre and other events like it. Professor Miller's comments remind us that really what I'm lamenting, or what we are lamenting, is the loss of common stories. Some years ago I went to the launch of a book by Christine Milne, the former leader of the Greens, and she talked about, it's not long ago that we talked about the same things, that media consumption was shared. She said then that there were fewer conversations with people of different attitudes or political stripes in the same room, that it was really hard to move on any policy with people of different persuasion. And as alluded to, politicians do use Facebook and other platforms to create their own separate news channels, to say what they like, shielded from scrutiny, and of course they may deny things like the efficacy of vaccines. Common knowledge here acts as a kind of vaccine against propaganda. It allows for shared understanding, constructive conversations, and policy reform for the common good. So how do we best defend and protect our common good rights to public communication? And Professor Miller did suggest some constructive solutions or ideas. They included shining a light on users, so social media users are known to us, we know who they are. And I think an important solution is supporting and strengthening a free and independent press. When I was a younger reporter with the ABC in regional New South Wales, I recognised just how important our public broadcaster is. I was waved at across the street like royalty on the main street of Musselbrook in the Upper Hunter. And I remember an older gentleman saying to me, you know, Tony, I wake up to you every morning and my wife doesn't mind. There was such a respect for the ABC then, it still is, but it has been weakened by political actors. So I think on that note, I want to start with my own question before Stephen Pickard picks it up and takes on others as he moderates, hopefully, a healthy debate among us. Can I start with a question about how we build robust media in this country? We seem to be reimagining almost how to redesign big tech, or how to start over should we have that privilege. And at the heart of it is growing trust. And I guess the context is that big tech, like most corporations, will not regulate itself well. In the modern slavery space, we cannot rely on Nestle to do the right thing. So you'll know that Australia is leading the way with draft legislation that proposes a tax, essentially a tax that returns money to mainstream media with a proposed bargaining code, ultimately to support quality journalism. What do you think of that idea?
Thank you very much, Tony, and Shanice, over to you. You can take that question, and then there'll be other comments and questions from the floor, and Hazel will be just standing in the aisle with her mic, and when you wish to ask a question or make a comment, please go there. You might like to line up now, and I'll see how we juggle this. First question, over to you, Shanice.
I think the best way to think of this is we in a liberal democracy, we've got a range of, let's call them, I'm calling them epistemic institutions who have as the primary role to find and disseminate knowledge and understanding. So that includes schools, universities, media, or at least that part of the media that's concerned with knowledge as opposed to simply entertainment. But it also includes, by the way, intelligence agencies and a range of other agencies. One thinks here of pandemics, the need to get information in that space. So those institutions become and continue to be extremely important and need and to some extent are being corroded by in this social media context. So one of the main things we need to do is make sure that they are robust and are maintained. So in that context, clearly with the issue around advertising money being lost by the media, the traditional media as it were, then that obviously has to be redressed if we're going to retain that media, which is critically important that we do. And again, some of these suggestions I made in relation to disinformation and propaganda is there to blunt some of the excesses of social media and some of the problems arising from social media. But at the same time, I take it that the idea is, as it were, to sort of return to where we were. We're not going to return to where we were because we've now got some powerful new technologies that are problematic in various ways, but are also potentially extremely beneficial in terms of, as I said, if we're talking about political communication, if you've got large numbers of members of the citizenry that actually can communicate directly with large numbers of other citizens, on the face of it, that looks actually like a pretty good thing and not something that representative democracies have had before. It's similar but quite different, I think. There's a lot of talk about direct democracies, not direct democracies, for the simple reason that in a direct democracy, at least in Athens or somewhere, most of the people could at some time or other communicate with most of the other people. That's not going to happen. I mean, what you're really talking about is some small number of people being able to communicate to large numbers of people. But a lot of people being able to hear, nevertheless, voices that they didn't hear before. So the question becomes, how do we harness the benefits of that whilst reducing the deleterious effects? But yeah, I mean, in terms of that quite specific question, yeah, we need to hang on to the epistemic institutions that we have, and we need to strengthen them, and we certainly need to protect them against some of the worst effects of social media, such as in that particular case. So the answer, I think, is pretty clearly yeah.
Could you please say here when you make a comment or question?
My name is Paul Osborne. I'm the Bureau Chief with Australian Associated Press in the Press Gallery. And thank you very much for your speech tonight. I have two things to say. One's negative and one's very positive. The negative thing is, I think the real problem with the internet and social media is the amount of legacy material that's floating around. And I'm talking about like conspiracy theories and false information that's been around for years and years and years. And it keeps getting recycled through Facebook and Twitter. And I came across an example on Tuesday night. My 10-year-old came up to me and said, "Dad, do you know Michael Jackson is still alive?" And I went, "No, he's not, Gwen." And she grabbed my phone and she Googled it. And there was a picture of Michael Jackson sitting in a car taken like 2 years ago. I went, "That's a fake photo, Gwen. That's a fake. It's a deep fake photo. It's not real." She says, "Oh, my friend told me Michael Jackson's still alive." I'm sorry, like I was reporting on the day. I remember sitting in my desk, reading the Reuters story, breaking news, getting my reporters to follow it up. It's real, he's dead. So I had to try and convince her that this recycled piece of nonsense was fake. And that's exactly what our children are reading now. And I think it's probably the key problem with social media and the internet is this legacy material. And I think it really needs to be clean up. I'm not sure how we do it. But it's worse than fake news. It's recycled fake news. And my positive point is that I work at AAP. It used to be owned by Fairfax and News Corps. But we've through circumstances beyond our control, they don't own us anymore. And we're now owned by philanthropists, and we're a charity, which is kind of a weird feeling, having worked for a corporation for so long, owned by the two big media barons, instead of set up by Rupert's dad. But I say that in that we now have an independent board, we have a charter of journalism integrity, a charter of independence, and we have we've got a fact-checking service, so we're one of the biggest fact-checking services in Australia as well, apart from the ABC's RMIT setup. And we're trying to deliver some of the things that the Professor was talking about today. So we're trying to counter misinformation, trying to be positive, be independent, be straight down the line journalism. So the renewal is happening, but it's going to take a huge effort. And you talked about resources and the News Media Bargaining Code. That's all part of it. It takes more resources and more independence and more independent thinking journalists, I think, and then we can get there. So, thank you very much.
I won't say anything about the positive point. I mean, it seems like a fair point. On the negative one, I'm not sure it is a negative point. I mean, there are two separate questions here. One question is how much, as it were, material out there is, as it were, in storage, if you like, that's false. Well, as long as it's just in storage, I mean, it'd be good to get rid of it, destroy it. So, but the problem is, as you gave your example, people are communicating it, right? So whether or not they're communicating falsehoods which they dreamt up yesterday, or resending material that someone else dreamt up yesterday, or just sending out false material that was stored somewhere 10 years ago, it's the current impact that concerns me. So I think we're probably swimming in the same direction there. I think there's the problem with legacy material, but I think the real problem is it was just sitting there gathering dust, as it were, or whatever electronic data does, not being accessed. Wouldn't be such a problem. Thank you.
I'm Bill Bush. I'm the most ancient member of the CES committee. My question goes to freedom of speech. We've seen how in the United States, through the Cambridge Analytica manipulation of the fault lines in society, how these have been sort of widened by disinformation and playing up of racial divisions. And of course, Chris Wiley in his book seems to put a very good case that, in fact, the 2016 election in the United States was won by that means, and also that the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom in its referendum in the same year was also brought about by that. And Tony Hassan, it was the first time, thank you for mentioning the Myanmar link between it, but I mean, not only did the generals utilise Facebook to create it, but Facebook, in the goodness of their heart, saw something of the trouble that was happening, and they barred the Rohingya people from using Facebook. So it was a little bit easier on one. Look, anyhow, this is all a privilege. My question, which is about Tony Abbott in the context of the Racial Discrimination Act, 18C. He said I think that same year, any suggestion you can have free speech as long as it doesn't hurt people's feeling is ridiculous. And you might recall his Attorney General said the same year that people do have a right to be bigots. And this was, of course, about Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, where the move was to eliminate the words offend, insult, or humiliate, and replace it with the word harass. Now, I mean, it seems to me a reasonable case to say, from the example of Cambridge Analytica, what they've managed to do, that the full import of freedom of speech has the capacity to completely undermine social cohesion that Tony was talking about. In fact, to destroy the very conditions upon which any healthy democracy can flourish. And I just wonder if you would have any sort of comments on that, and where, as it were, good manners should, as it were, be injected into the issue.
Yeah, so, well, on the Russian thing first, I mean, the political, the Cambridge Analytica, I mean, you know, they use bots and botnets and so on, but what's the principle there? Well, I think the principle is that when you're talking about political communication within a polity, there are people who have a right to participate, and then there are people who don't. They may have a right to observe, they may have a right to make comments and so on. So, if we go back to fundamentals, the Russians do not have a right to intervene in a US election in terms of, as it were, quasi participants, to be part of the deliberative process and present themselves as such. They can have a right to make comments on the sidelines and so on. So I think that was the fundamental problem. Of course, they used a whole lot of techniques that need to be combated and could be combated, I think, to some extent, in terms of what my suggestions were. Anyway, that is as it is. On the issue of let's call it, I suppose, hate speech is, I think, the thing that you're kind of talking about. I mean, there's other issues there about more general issues of offence to others, which may not be specifically hate speech. Those areas, there is a basic right to freedom of speech, and unfortunately, I think we do want to allow people to speak in ways that other people may find offensive. There's no getting around that. The question is, where are we going to draw a line? So we can't have people trashing other people. We want laws of obscenity. When it comes to hate speech, if for example, you're saying things that are not only not true, but are inflaming tensions within a group, or if there's some other contextual issues. So, for example, the Germans, you can't say various things about Jewish people you might be able to say in some other country, and that might be appropriate in their context. It might not be appropriate somewhere else. So I don't think that issue is particularly clear-cut. I think it's one that needs to be thought through. I mean, one of the interesting things, maybe to this audience, is blasphemy. I mean, so people saying deeply offensive things about Muslims or about Christians. And, okay, you might think, well, if you take the Charlie Hebdo incident, and Virginia's written something about this, a lot of the material that, this was proclaimed as a great sort of instance of free speech. I mean, a lot of the things that they were saying were pretty offensive and arguably shouldn't have been said, and weren't in particular being said in a manner that was well motivated. And so then the question is, well, we don't want to encourage that sort of thing, but on the other hand, we might not want to censor it. But on the other hand, if you've got people disrupting say, a religious gathering, they just sort of just come into church and start trashing the icon or whatever, then you say, well, hang on, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to let that run. But I think the the general answer to your question is, yeah, we need freedom of speech, and unfortunately, at times, in allowing freedom of speech, it will be offensive to people, some people sometimes. On the other hand, we do want to be able to control some of that stuff, and it's a tricky business, I think, to figure out exactly where you draw the lines in terms of hate speech, blasphemy, and so on. One thing is for sure, though, if you've got, coming back to your point about civility, if you've got a community which is well informed, fairly rational in its thinking, and respectful in general of people, that is, who regards other people in the community as worthy of respect, even if we disagree. If you have that kind of, for want of a better word, culture in a particular community, then that will go a long way to dealing with the problem, because when those people, coming back to the anonymity point, when they have to be, if they're identified as such, then they will be the recipients of social disapproval, and that may well be enough, even if you can't and don't want to enforce the law against them. Mobilising social disapproval, it would be extremely helpful. I think one of the issues here, coming back to the sort of Christian or more broadly religious community ideas, probably a concept that needs to be put on the table, particularly in the context of Facebook and Zuckerberg talking about his community. Gee, that's nice, the community of people that get to be advertised to on the basis of algorithm. But it is an important notion, the notion of a moral community, which is to say a community which is one that has a set of moral principles that are reasonable and that are respected, and that govern the community in the sense that people comply with them, even if they're not, as it were, enforced by the law. And so that notion, I think, is one that needs to be taken on board in, so to speak, digital communities. I talk about digital communities. Well, what are the moral norms? What are the sorts of respect that ought to be accorded to people, and so on and so forth. And that, I guess, brings with it the residences of Christian communities, complying with Christian principles, and so on and so forth.
Simon Clark is my name. I have no title other than being an avid consumer of media and a lover of history. I have a few concerns. First of all, thank you, Tony and Shanice, for stimulating all of us, I'm sure, and giving us lots to think about. I think we have to be really careful not to have rose-coloured hindsight. The reality is misinformation, as it has always been. It's not something that's been created by the digital society. And if by free press we mean a press that always tells us the truth, we've never had such a thing. Our society, our culture is based on myth. As Australians, we probably all grew up with the myth of pretty much an empty land with very few Aboriginal people. And perhaps it's due to the modern media that we're finally starting to realise the extent of the massacres and the rehomings and so on that have taken place. I think if we start to posit solutions that allow for a wider police powers, we need to be very, very careful, because that can be a slippery slope. And I was disappointed that neither speaker mentioned education. As a 45-year educationalist, basically working with marginalised teenagers, I think education is a really critical thing. Teaching kids and teaching ourselves as adults to read sources and to investigate where the source has come from. And a very wise supervisor of mine once said to me, Simon, you should try and aim to read at least 2 sources each day that you know you won't agree with. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm in furious agreement with you about education. I think mention epistemic institution, but one of the obviously fundamental ones is the schools and universities and so on. We need to induct obviously young people into processes of reading, thinking for themselves, etc., being able to deliberate with one another, and so on and so forth. That's pretty fundamental. And of course, one of the things that's perhaps happened in recent times, a good thing that's happened is perhaps mass university education, more people going to university. Perhaps a bad thing that's happened is that the universities have geared themselves perhaps more to the market than is good for the wider society and is consistent with, as we're educating people to be participants in a deliberative democracy. On the question of wider police powers, well, no, I'm not suggesting wider police powers because I'm suggesting current laws, and what I'm talking about is giving the police the powers that they currently don't have to enforce laws that are being blatantly violated on a very large scale every day of the week. So if this statutory authority is set up, independent authority, you need to be breaking the law, and all that's actually going on is that you will, if you break the law, then you'll be able to be brought to book. But so I don't accept that it's wider police powers. I don't think that's what's going on. In relation to your points about the past, yes, the free press in Australia has not been perfect. I mean, obviously it's improving, as we just heard, but it hasn't been perfect. There's been a lot of intervention. Someone mentioned the murder press, in particular the murder press. There's been a tendency, let's say, for an owner to intervene. It had inadequate editorial independence. I don't think and I know you work for the ABC. I think the ABC's treatment of Pell was pretty shoddy, really, and pretty sloppy journalism. Not something to be very proud of, and was a good example of an ideology creeping into the work of what should have been objective journalism. So yeah, look, there are a whole lot of cases from the past and the present in relation to the Australian Free Press. You can find lots of examples of flaws and deficiencies, but I don't want to go to China and live with the press in China. Okay, so I think we need to get realistic about look at the Australian Free Press, not just in terms of where it's gone wrong and mistakes it's made and the problems that it needs to rectify. Let's just think about some other presses around the planet. Think about China. Think about what's happening in other places that are not liberal democracies, not only not in name, but not even remotely close to it. So I'm still pretty happy to run with the Australian Free Press. Final point, of course, in terms of history, history is always a contested area, and obviously it's often the case that, as it were, the powerful or the colonisers or whatever write the history and write themselves in But again, this comes back to the epistemic institutions. It's up to the people, academics, it's up to the journalists and so on, to stay with the objective truth, stay with the evidence, and sort these things out. And sometimes it's the history of white Australia that's been sugar-coated, and sometimes it's current problems in Aboriginal communities which we don't want to talk too much about because that's not where we're kind of what we're comfortable with. So it kind of cuts both ways.
I'm sorry, we've got to be very careful with the time. If you've got a question, Jill, that'll be the last one, I'm afraid. But when we have a cup of tea later on, please feel free to have a conversation with Shanice. So we'll be around for those other questions and comments you might like to make. But I'm very conscious of the time. So Jill, if you've got a question, you're happy to leave it, or yeah, you can ask it, but just keep
I'll
it
try and shorten it. Thank you to
Yeah.
Simon for setting the scene. I guess I was a little bit disappointed that you didn't, that you focused on one sort of aspect of what's wrong with social media, how it can be used for what might be called evil, and you propose some remedies. But there are other problems, a bit like, like the algorithms that foster the echo chambers and the addiction. And you also raised the issue of where we draw the line. For example, I think climate change is a really good line. Saying things that do harm, and you didn't put that in the harm bracket. But I would say that social media is used a lot for good and for grassroots connection, education, and organising, and it's mainly by people rather than by bots. So, what would you propose to safeguard social media's good use? Would it, and particularly where people would not necessarily use it if they had to be completely public in their small groups, particularly at the beginning? Would it involve things like banning bots or regulating algorithms or mandating fact-checking? And if so, who would do this at a time, who would do this checking at a time when state actors are heavily involved in division and fake news and overstepping the mark in terms of national security? Thanks.
Okay, so let me just say generally that I blame Stephen for the fact that I just focused principally on anonymity. There are a whole lot of other things, but he told me I could only speak for half an hour, so... but yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a whole lot of different dimensions to this, and I kind of gave a bit of an overview and then focused on one of them. Could easily have talked about a whole lot of other ones. On the second thing, I thought I did try to make it clear that I thought that social media was a good thing in a lot of different ways, and I certainly don't want to get rid of it. And you gave some examples of its utility and so on. I maybe mistake there. I'm not suggesting that everyone who is on social media should. You can't get on social media and be anonymous. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that you need to be registered, and if you engage in unlawful practices, cite violence, etc., etc. And secondly, that if you become a powerful public communicator, then you need to be who you are needs to be identified. So I don't see the anonymity being removed, which is consistent, of course, with people who don't want to be anonymous, making clear who they are, what they're doing, and so on. Things like echo chambers and so on. This is just part and parcel of the problem, as are some of the use of machine learning and so on, bots and so on. Those questions depend. So if you take the echo chamber thing, this seems to be a problem which a lot of people have talked about, where you in a polity where we want, especially political communication, to be such that we're talking to the public at large, and there's a shared set of, as it were, experiences and a more or less shared factual basis. There's a kind of a background assumption that we've got the same kind of understanding of roughly where we want to go and so on within, although there are going to be important differences. And the point about the echo chamber thing is that when you end up with people who only talk to other people like them and only get the sort of facts that support their position, then you are obviously undermining a deliberative democracy where you've got different groups, different voices. You want them to collide, and you want to have them discuss and disagree, but also within the context of having a sort of shared overall framework, and to some extent a set of shared experiences and understanding. I take it that one of the problems with say, echo chambers and so on is that they undermine that, so that the public space in a particular polity is reduced and not utilised and so on. Your other point, well, the machine learning thing, machine learning is a useful thing, it's great in a lot of ways, but if the doctors can spot, poor old, sorry. you got to like, been out in the sun, something occurs to me that, machine learning tells you whether or not this spot is malignant or not, and does a better job than other people. So sure, machine learning, fantastic, right? But in the hands of, say, social media companies who are preoccupied with making money and selling ads and so on, sort of developing profiles of people for the purpose of selling them particular goods and fine-tuning this and so on. Is that a great idea? Well, it has a lot of bad effects. It can be useful insofar as it draws people's attention to particular things that they might not otherwise be aware of and that they're interested in. On the other hand, it also has the effect of sort of, as it was, restricting this sort of conception of what they might be interested in, because it wants to, as it would, drive them in a particular direction, and that could be bad for them. The general point I think about machine learning is that it's a tool. It does some terrific things, and it does some really bad things, some very unhelpful things. So I don't know what I can say much more than that without going into specific detail.
Thanks, Shanice.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask Clive Roger, who's the co-chair of the Christians for an Ethical Society, to give a vote of thanks to Shanice and put us in the picture about the next address. Thanks, Clive.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you for attending tonight. I think it's been a very lively, engaging, informative discussion. I noted a few words. It's been sharp, it's been challenging, it's been informative, and we've had some very constructive suggestions. Seamus, thank you for the work that's gone into for the preparation of your address. Philosophers have the capacity to analyse things, to look at the inherent contradictions in arguments, and I think society greatly benefits from having philosophers. And thank you for the analysis you have given tonight. I think society also greatly benefits from the role of journalists, and Tony Hassan has demonstrated her skills as a journalist, and she's still writing for the Canberra Times with